I'm Derek T. Dingle, Chief Content Officer at Black Enterprise. I hope you've enjoyed all the sessions at today's summit, but we're not finished yet. We're closing out with a highly anticipated session, the impact of ERGs on creating a more inclusive corporate America, hosted by Fidelity Investments. As corporations develop racial equity agendas, a growing number of them have become increasingly reliant on employee resource groups. In this session, we have one of the leading executives driving DEI, Wendy John, Head of Global Diversity and Inclusion at Fidelity Investments. Wendy, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah. The first question I want to ask you, and this is, we talked a bit about this, but I think this would be very interesting for our audience. Share with us where the events that occurred at the time that you assumed your position. You've been head of global diversity and inclusion for the past year, and I just think that will perfectly set up the conversation to come.
Sure. Thank you, Derek.
Yeah.
So while I've been at Fidelity for over 20 years, I only recently assumed the role of head of global diversity and inclusion in July of last year. And so very much at the peak of awareness around social equity and racial justice issues, and in the wake of the George Floyd murder. So for me, it was an interesting time. I had a lot of opportunity to reflect on stepping into a role like this at that time. I perhaps am a little bit of a reluctant head of D&I because, to step into a role like this in the middle of a pandemic, took some courage, right? I'd also say the good news is I know Fidelity very well, having been here for a long time. I've had a successful career here, but I've also had the experience of many underrepresented groups where you're not always sure that your voice is heard, and you want to make sure that others can see you, right, for your real identity. So the opportunity to lead those efforts for others was very compelling to me.
Yeah, courageous is the perfect adjective for coming into a position during such unprecedented times, and we're still dealing with the challenges of the pandemic and trying to adjust to the new focus on racial equity. Before I ask you about the DEI strategy specifically, a lot of comments that I received from individuals have been, this time is different, meaning this time in terms of the corporate commitment to racial equality and opportunities for African Americans, especially in the workplace, is different. I'd like to get your views on that.
Sure. I feel like we are having conversations in the workplace that if you had asked me a year ago at the start of the pandemic, whether we would be talking about, racial equity, social justice, systemic issues that drive inequality in the workplace, I probably would have been very skeptical. We are having the types of honest discussions that many of us have longed for, but candidly weren't sure would ever happen. I believe that the pandemic set the stage for us to all sort of be in our homes, unable to perhaps look away from the truths that were coming to us across our television screens. And at a time when we all were pretty vulnerable and didn't have a lot of the distractions that you normally would have that would allow you to maybe escape from that reality. And so I think it's that collective awareness that feels different to me than prior advances or discussions in this area.
Yeah. So given the environment, how have that impacted, Fidelity Investments DEI strategy? Even though you're new to the role, you're a 24-year veteran. You've, definitely have been engaged at some levels with D&I, and just like to get your perspective on how has current events sort of reshaped the strategy in that regard.
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things happened for us last summer. So my predecessor, actually took another role within the firm, that gave her the opportunity to put D&I into action. So she took a senior sales leadership role that had never been held before by a female. And that gave us the opportunity to think about what did we want the next leader of our efforts to be and where should that work sit. And so, with me taking on the reins of these responsibilities, we actually moved our D&I into its own separate function, out of HR, but in close partnership with HR, and reporting directly into our chief financial officer. So for me, that sent a very strong message in terms of the level of priority as well as financial support. And it certainly raised the level of visibility across the firm. With it happening at the same time that, in the wake of those other events, there was just a different kind of enthusiasm and energy across our firm. Many, many associates were reaching out to say, I want to help, tell me what I can do. There have been so many articles and conversations happening both in the workplace and outside that I just think that there are a number of people who have been somewhat jolted into action. And so for me, it's a blessing and a curse. I've never had this much engagement or support. I hear from many of my other chief diversity officer colleagues that they're experiencing the same thing. And so that's why my 7 months probably feels a little bit closer to 7 years in the job, because every day is a full day.
Wow. Wow. It's you're looking at every aspect of the business, every aspect of how you touch the lives and of your customers and the communities in which you serve. A driving force in the recent DEI efforts has been employee resource groups. Obviously, over the years, these workplace affinity groups, business resource groups have been vital for driving companies forward, but they've taken on a special significance. More corporations are engaging with them, using them to help communicate to not only other executives within the company, but the community as a whole. Share with me your thoughts on, in this current environment, how ERGs have changed and how specifically they've changed within the Fidelity organization.
It's a great question. I would say our employee resource groups, and actually affinity groups, because we have both employee resource groups and special interest groups, are our model for inclusion at Fidelity. What I mean by that is, although they're self-organized and focused on specific communities, they're open to everyone. And we actually encourage all associates to use these affinity groups to gain a better understanding of others, even despite differences. So we offer 10 self-organized affinity groups. ERGs, or employee resource groups, have common interests across certain specific areas. So that might be race, it could be ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, or people who share an affinity based on similar sets of experiences. Our special interest groups provide each other with support and a sense of community. And we organize all of those groups around the 4C model of careers, commerce, community, and culture. So while many companies may refer to business resource groups, for us, we help the company drive value for our customers through the commerce pillar. So members play consultative roles for the business. They provide critical input on the design and relevance of products and services. And at Fidelity, we put the customer first. We talk about being customer obsessed. So for us, diversity and inclusion is not just the right thing to do, but we feel like we have a very strong business imperative to do so. We're celebrating 75 years this year, and our customers have changed significantly over that period of time. And so it's important for us to actually be able to mirror and understand and anticipate those differentiated experiences that our customers are expecting from us. And we believe the only way to do that is by representing that diversity within our workforce.
You're very familiar with ERGs within Fidelity, having been involved with organizing some of them. And I want to focus on one ERG in particular, Aspire, which focuses on African American and Latinx employees. It celebrated its 10th anniversary,
Yeah.
if I'm correct, and want to know, over those 10 years, how has it changed? How has it become more impactful? How has it become more of a resource, if you will, for both employees and the company, especially corporate leadership?
Yeah. So when we started Aspire 10 years ago, I think we were really just trying to create and replicate an informal network that we had already in existence. But we wanted to make sure that we were reaching all of the associates that identified as Black or Latinx. And so it started first by creating regional chapters and putting a national governance model together. Never would I have imagined that 10 years later, last October, we were celebrating the launch of Aspire International with additional chapters in India and Ireland. And so now we have over 5,000 associates and allies who are members of Aspire and who participate in a number of conversations that we have that bring a lot of different perspective. Obviously, this conversation is happening in Black History Month, and we're in the process of celebrating Black history as our history, and really using the opportunity to educate others about all of the contributions that African Americans and Black pioneers have made and how they are foundational to America. What I would say about Aspire is over time, it expanded beyond just that sense of community to really becoming a group that could provide business value, help us in terms of making sure that our visual imagery and the user experience was meeting the needs of our own communities, right? We are able to speak on behalf of them. And then I'd be remiss in saying that last summer, Aspire played a key role in helping our organization develop the muscle around having these candid, uncomfortable conversations about social justice and racial equity.
So in terms of the conversations, I just want to delve deeper. How are they facilitated? When do you start the conversations? And when do conversations become initiatives?
Sure. Well, I would say a couple of things. I think the first thing was there were a couple of areas where Aspire used their voice to speak on the leaders of Aspire, use their voice to speak on behalf of their membership, to express that the events that were happening outside our workplace were really, impacting us. And that there was a need and a desire to hear from leadership and others that they understood and that they supported. And like I mentioned about us all being in the pandemic, we're all in this virtual world. There is no line between work and home anymore, right? I'm talking to you.
All seamless.
Yeah, I'm talking to you from my home. So, it's seamless. And that's true about everything that we might be feeling and everything that we might be experiencing. And so I think there was the use of voice to create awareness. And then I believe that, one particular thread in our community chat amongst the Aspire community really did two things. One, it gave allies an opportunity to show up in the chat, pretty senior executives that maybe others didn't realize were members of Aspire, were able to weigh in and just share how they were feeling, as many of our members shared some of their personal experiences. And so, that created safe space for dialogue in a way that had not happened before. Now, in terms of how that then led to actions, as we then looked at opportunities to continue to partner in our communities and show up in a way that was very intentional, we engaged with Aspire, and that allowed us to continue to build upon already existing, connections that we had with organizations like 100 Black Men or Black Girls Code. So they are the ERGs and Aspire in particular are key partners for us as we decide on where to put our efforts. Fidelity's had a longstanding legacy of focusing on, financial literacy and education, where we think we can really have an impact. And Aspire has been a key part of that effort.
So I'd like to stay with allyship for a second. That is an important component of the DEI conversation today. How is that fostered across the organization, or how should corporations look at that and engage that level of allyship? I know it's come through conversations. Does it come through partnership with other ERGs?
Yes.
Does it, come through, partnership with other organizations outside, let's say in this case, the interests of African American or African American specific or African American focused organizations? How do you build that?
Yeah, so I think you can build it in a couple of ways, but I would tell you that the first thing was we actually, I think, had some allyship in action, even though we weren't calling it allyship.
Okay.
So many of our employee resource groups, right, have mentoring programs that allow others who are, particularly some of those individuals that are not from the specific community that's being served by that group, to participate in a way and get to know others better. And we encourage our associates to explore, right? Use your intellectual curiosity to spend time with somebody different from you. So that's kind of the beginning, I think, is it starts first with being willing to understand the lived experiences of others. And then with allyship being defined as more of a lifelong process of utilizing your own, political capital or positional capital on behalf of others, what we found was that people in proximity with those that are different from them started advocating on their behalf. Now, our most formal allyship, let's call it initiative, actually started first in our women's leadership group. There were two male senior leaders who in 2019 formed a group called the Allies Connection. And certainly they have, set a good foundation for us. I'm a huge advocate, though, of allyship for all, and the fact that we can be allies. Some of us who need an ally in some situations can actually be the ally in others. And so it's important to understand where you might have capital that you could use for others. Sometimes it's creating space just for someone to be able to speak their point of view in a meeting, right? In other times, it's, if you happen to be in a client-facing role and you're going to be presenting or you're doing a big presentation, can you bring somebody along who has an interest and just let them observe, right? So allyship can show up in many ways, but I think the most important thing is recognizing that allyship is a verb. It requires actions, it requires intention, and it's a lifelong thing. It's commitment to helping others with the capital that you might have.
So when you look at, that allyship, that also can translate into sponsorship as people are ascending through the organization, which leads me to my other question. We had talked about this, gaining the benefits of association in an ERG and what that can mean in terms of your career, and especially the importance and the ability to connect with leadership in another space outside your discipline, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I could use personal examples. So not only was I involved in, forming some of these groups, but I started off my career with Fidelity in Boston, and then I relocated to North Carolina. And I actually formed our first chapter of Aspire and our first chapter of our women's leadership group in North Carolina. And I was doing that more, like I said, initially to create community. But it gave me an opportunity. I was in a program management job at the time, but it gave me an opportunity to show my leadership in a different way, right? To practice communications. And I also was in forming the women's leadership group. I just reached out to the most senior women that I knew of in North Carolina and said, hey, would you be interested in doing this? And so that creates that opportunity for you to be in the presence of others that you might not otherwise have had that opportunity in the day-to-day job that you were in. So I encourage many of our associates to look to the ERGs, particularly when they're interested in maybe exploring other skills, right? We have a very large customer service organization and operations roles, and sometimes someone wants to get into project management. Well, a great way to do that is to take a leadership role in an ERG, right? It's a lot of work to be running these events or even just gathering different points of view, but it puts you in position with others who might not otherwise be in your path, right? And all of our affinity groups have executive sponsors that are senior leaders in the firm. And that's very important to us to make sure that the senior leadership has the opportunity to see the talent. And also back to the allyship, these are individuals, right, with positional and political capital who can advocate on your behalf in those rooms that we're not in. You mentioned sponsorship. So I did want to mention that one of the things that we know is that women and underrepresented groups require a greater level of advocacy and sponsorship to get those opportunities for more senior roles. And so we formed a program called LIFT. We like our acronyms at Fidelity. So LIFT stands for Leveraging and Inspiring Fidelity's Associates. And it's a sponsorship program for underrepresented associates, specifically women, Black, and Hispanic or Latinx employees, that creates visibility, exposure, and advocacy. And they get paired up with a senior leader. And they spend a great deal of time connecting. We provide the framework, but the connection is theirs to own. And I'm proud to say we started that program and we had it planned and conceived in 2019 and executed it in early 2020. And recently, some of the first two classes have said, we want to continue beyond the year that we had planned, which is fantastic because both the sponsors and the proteges want to continue to be in relationship with each other.
Yeah, one of the major challenges that Black enterprise is focused on in our coverage, even given this era, has been more African Americans, more Blacks, workers ascending to C-suite positions, senior management positions. What is the influence of, say, Aspire, ERGs, in creating that pipeline and pathway to those leadership spots?
Yeah, so I think we're all very committed to seeing that. And I think where Aspire and the ERGs play a role is in the development, right? So I mentioned that 4C model. And one of the things that's in there is careers, right? It's actually the first of the C's. And so we focus on two things. One, talent identification, right? So you have to know who's there.
Okay.
And then the other is offering or connecting to professional development opportunities to ensure that people are ready, right? And so that's a lot. That's kind of two critical pieces. Often it's back to this: we're in a role. We start off our careers. We pick, an entry point, and it isn't always representative of our full skill set. So how do we make sure that people can understand all of the skills and all of the experiences that you have, and bring that to bear in the organization? And then, like I mentioned, we have these sponsorship programs. We have other programs for sort of mid-career and others, because we're very focused on creating, mobility opportunities and promotion opportunities that get you ready and where you can build that kind of multifaceted career. I would tell you myself, I always set a goal every year to acquire a new skill or get exposure to some new aspect of the firm. And, with Fidelity being a diversified financial services company, you actually have the opportunity to see various parts of the business, right? It's not all investment and trading. And there is value, right? Particularly at the C-suite level. You're looking for more general management skills. And so it's important that you are thoughtful along the way to make sure you're getting those different experiences. And we think that some of these programs that we've developed are helping to put not just individuals in proximity with leaders, but individuals in proximity with others in other types of roles across the business, right? Where you can hear about some of these other jobs and other lines of business from people who are currently doing the role that look like you.
Well, one of the comments that we got back from some of the ERG leaders is that even though we have higher visibility, even though we have greater access to leadership, and we're helping develop and promote diversity initiatives, the onus is still on the leadership to open up those positions and create access to senior leadership positions, and eventually expand the C-suite with African American executives. That is vital. And they said that even though we want to be engaged, we don't want that to dismiss or to push aside the responsibility to have that focus on the leadership side.
I would agree, Derek. I think this is about being able to see and assess talent differently, right? The talent may not be in the places that we're used to looking for it, and it may not come in the forms that we're used to seeing it show up in. And so absolutely there's shared ownership here, right? And what we're trying to do from my function is really help leaders understand and hire for skill, right? Because some of the experience might not be there, but people can learn.
Well, you're in a perfect position to, both share the experience of ERG and both share the experience of leadership. This is a great conversation, all too short, but I've enjoyed it. Before we depart, is there any last points that you'd like to leave our audience with in terms of ERGs, engagement, forming ERGs, or anything that comes to mind that you'd like to leave us with?
I think the most important point I would try to share is really about inclusion, right? You can have diversity without inclusion, and you can have inclusion without diversity. And so to me, the real value of the ERGs is in getting people who otherwise might not interact with each other to interact in a really meaningful, intentional way. I'll give a few examples. We have, because at the end of the day, this isn't all personal. This is about individuals, right? We have had, many of our associates whose, their children are identifying differently, perhaps as non-binary, and they really didn't know how to have that conversation. And they found tremendous value in our Pride ERG, helping them how to have that conversation. It's similar for many of, a lot of people are in multiracial family scenarios, right? Or have adopted children of other races or ethnicities. And so ERGs provide a value that, yes, absolutely on the business level, but I think some of the most impactful work we see is very personal, where people find themselves or they find a home or perspective in their relationships formed through these groups. So I try to emphasize that it's not about, we're not creating, we're not dividing up our population into little groups. And by the way, we have over 22,000 of our employees who are members of our affinity groups, and many are members of 2 or 3 of them. But what we see is there's lower attrition rate for those that are members of these groups, right? There's higher levels of associate engagement because they're finding, a safer place there, right? Where their voice matters and it's safe for them to ask questions. So I would just say, before you go off and try to hire for diversity, which it appears everybody is trying to do right now, first do that introspection and make sure that you have the infrastructure and the muscle internally where that diverse talent will feel welcome and will feel like they have found a place where they can thrive. That's what we're prioritizing, although we definitely are also looking to hire a lot of talent.
This has been great. One of the takeaways that has come out of this, as well as some of our other sessions today, is let your voice be heard in this era. And ERGs is one of the platforms to have your voice heard. So thank you so much, Wendy. This was a great conversation. Really enjoyed it. It was powerful. I'd like to come back again a few months from now to see, how things are going. And best of luck as you continue to pursue your DEI efforts.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'd be happy to come back.
Thanks, Wendy. Well, it's a wrap for our inaugural Black Enterprise Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Summit. I hope that you gained a better understanding how major corporations are applying DEI best practices, addressing the advancement of Black executives, and the importance of your voice and engagement in the process. I would like to thank all of our speakers for sharing relevant and resonant content on DEI in the current environment. I would also like to recognize and extend our appreciation to our sponsors, AT&T, Fidelity Investments, and Toyota, for making our summit possible. Lastly, I would like to thank you for attending our event and being a great audience. If you missed any of the sessions, we have made all the summit content available on blackenterprise.com. Once again, thanks for your participation, and be on the lookout for our upcoming all-new summits, which we'll post each month. In closing, stay safe, stay well, and continued success in your career and business pursuits.